How do you safely connect to APIs in .NET Core? HTTP Client is the way to go, but doing it right is important. Otherwise, you could exhaust your connection pool and cause issues in your application and your computer. In this video, we're going to connect to an external API in Blazor server using HTTP Client to see what our various options are for getting data from the web. Now, if this is your first time watching a video of mine, my name is Tim Corey, and it's my goal to make learning C# easier. One of the ways I do that is by teaching context. There are a lot of tutorials out there that will teach you what to do. I go a few steps beyond that to show you when to do it, why you should or should not do it, what pitfalls to avoid, and what the best practices are. Basically, I get you ready for the real world. If that is the type of training you're interested in, subscribe to my channel and hit the little bell icon to be notified when I release new videos. Okay, let's head over to Visual Studio and we're going to create a new project in Blazor. So new project, and right down here, Blazor app. And now that we have a new release, we actually have the option of Blazor server or client or WebAssembly. So let's call this our HTTP Client demo, and we'll call this Client Demo App. Okay. And the option here is now Blazor Server or Blazor WebAssembly App. This is the Blazor client. So they've kind of gone back and forth. Now they're going to call it WebAssembly, and that's what we'll use going forward. So we're going to choose a Blazor Server because this is the web project type that I would assume that you will start to default to. I know I have. It's just kind of the best of both worlds, both the server and the client. So you could also choose a Razor Pages project in ASP.NET Core or MVC.NET Core or even API in .NET Core. There's a lot of different options you could choose, but this will work just fine. Let's hit Create. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a small API that I have that's on the web. It's not mine personally, but I've got a URL to a little weather service API. So we're going to connect to that. So let's start off by going into our startup.cs file. This is where we're going to configure some services. Now, this is all for dependency injection, and dependency injection is built right into ASP.NET Core projects. If you're using console or WPF core or WinForm core, it is there to have dependency injection. It's just not enabled by default. So you can still have it, and this HTTP client will work in those scenarios as well. So just note that this would work in any .NET Core project type, not just the one I'm showing you. All right, the first thing we're going to do is just say services dot add HTTP client. And it's as simple as that. What that's going to do is it's going to add an HTTP client factory into our dependency injection system. That way we can access it at any point. So now what we're going to do is we're going to add one NuGet package. This NuGet package is not required, but I'm going to use it because it greatly improves how you work with HTTP client. There's a bunch of extension methods that it adds that just make things into one-liners instead of multi-line configurations that we're often going to forget. So let's go to dependencies. And this is actually from Microsoft. It's not necessarily a third party. It is system.net.http.json. And so this provides extension methods for the HTTP client and content that perform automatic serialization and deserialization using system.text.json. So this is a newer package. It was actually published, the latest version was published on May 18th, 2020. That's the version I'm using, version 3.2.0. So we'll install that. And this just makes, like I said, life easier. So that's all you need to have for NuGet packages. Okay. And now what we can do is we can create our page. Let's go to Pages, and we're going to right-click here and we'll add a new Razor component. Now it's on the right-click menu, which is nice. Or you could go to New Item and go to Find Razor Component. But just note this is a Razor component, not a Razor page. There's a difference. A Razor page is a server-side only page. That's not what we want in a Blazor application. A Blazor application is composed of Razor components. So Razor component, you get the .razor extension onto the end of this. And let's call this weather data. Now we do have another component already built in to our template called fetch data that's going to get weather forecast service. This is something totally different. So just note that it is different, but it's going to still get weather information. This one's going to get it from an API though. Now let's start, before we start modifying this page, we do need a model to put this data into. So let's right click on our project and say add, new folder, we'll call it models. And in here, we're going to create a new class. And we'll call this class weather forecast model. How about that? But what properties do we have? Well, we don't really know yet, right? Because we haven't even looked at what the API call is. So let's do that. Now I've got a API service I'm using. So let's paste it in here. It's metaweather.com. It does not require a login, and it's a pretty simplistic service, but it's a really nice service. And the fact that it has HTTPS, it doesn't have CORS or cross-origin request on there, so we can just call it directly from our API. So therefore, we can just run this, and this is for the closest location to me, which is Philadelphia. So it doesn't have every location, but this one is in the Eastern US time zone, and the location is Philadelphia. Sorry, that's a little small there. How about that? A little better. So this is the request you get back from this particular API call. Now this number right there, that is the WOE ID, WOE ID for Philadelphia. You can look up your own if you went to metaweather.com and did a search for your location. So I'm going to copy all of this JSON data, because that's what it is, that came back from that call. Now I'm going to do is below this class, I'm not going to do it inside the class, below this class, let's say edit, paste special, paste JSON as classes. And this is an awesome feature. What this will do is, let's just run it. Notice I had just created multiple classes in here. We have the root object, we have the parent, we have consolidated weather, we have source class. All right, and if you look at the properties in here, you'll see sunrise, sunset, time zone name, title, location type, WOE ID, lat lon, time zone, and so on. So it's got a whole bunch of information in here that all comes from that API. So what it did is it read that JSON data and said, okay, here are the things you have in here. For example, there's an array of consolidated weather items. So that's the property name, and then it gave a class name that matches that property name. It's just that this is capitalized. So the naming is not great. It's not necessarily C# specific, and we could fix this and could tweak a lot of it. We'll do a little bit of that just to show you how to do it, but the reality is that I'm not going to clean up all the way because I don't need to spend time on that portion of it. So just note you can decorate these and say, okay, if they're bringing in as JSON, this is the JSON name, but here is the C# equivalent of that name. For example, I wouldn't call this consolidated weather. With an underscore, I have a capital C and a capital W probably, but then I couldn't have the class name be the same thing. So there'd be some tweaks to it. So let's first of all rename root object. I'm going to rename it the weather forecast model, like so, and delete this other class. So now we have the weather forecast model. And this consolidated weather, let's change that. Let's collapse parent here. consolidated weather, let's change this to day forecast model, because this is in control dot to rename that, which also renames it up here. So what this is all the weather for the various days. I believe it's like a 5-day forecast or something like that. So it'll give you 5 different days of information on things like the min temperature, the max temperature, the wind speed, the direction, the air pressure, humidity, visibility, and so on. So we're going to keep that. We do want that, but some of the stuff we don't need. For example, time, we don't need that. So let's get rid of it. Time zone name, I believe that was the one that said lat long we don't need, but time zone, not time zone name, just time zone is potentially important. So let's keep that one, but we'll not keep these other things down here. We'll keep the title, and we'll take out source and parent. Don't need those. Don't need time zone name. So we grab a few pieces of data. Notice I can just delete this stuff. If I don't want it to be captured, it won't be captured. It will just capture what properties that match what's in the JSON returned values. So I don't need a parent class at all, so let's get rid of that. I also don't need a source class down here. Let's get rid of that as well. So now I have just 2 classes. I have the weather forecast model, which is the overall model, and then inside there it has a list of day forecast models, which are the different days that it's forecasting. So let's go through the day forecast model. Let's get rid of ID. We'll keep weather state name, take out the abbreviation, the compass, the created, take out those 3 properties. Applicable date, that means which date the forecast is for, so let's keep that. Min and max temperature, we'll keep that. Note that that is in Celsius. So those of you in the US, it'll look a little different, but no worries, you could convert that if you wanted to. Again, it's outside the scope of this demo. Let's take the other things off. I don't think we need to have all that data, just the weather state name, the applicable date, min, max temperature. Okay? Now, we could do, if you wanted to fix some of these things, for example, title. Well, it should be a capital T normally. You can control dot and fix the name violation. As long as it changes just the casing, you don't have to decorate this class and say what the JSON equivalent value is. It will take care of the capitalization without a problem. So again, we can fix time zone, but notice sunset. I fixed that. It just capitalized the sun, not the set, because it's an underscore, not our normal naming convention. So that would be something, whoops. There we go. That'd be something I would address in a real application by decorating these. Okay. Again, outside the scope of this video, I just want to show you that you can do at least this much and make it a little bit closer to a C# specific formatting. Ideally, if you control the API side of it as well, you would send it without the underscores. That way, we could match them up without having to do anything beyond just changing the casing. Okay. So the way I would send, say, sunrise, is I would send it as sunrise, like so. That'd be the JSON version, which we then would change to sunrise, and it would match the C# casing. So you could do something like that very easily, but with the underscores here, it makes things a little messier. But again, I don't control this API. All right, so there are my 2 classes. I can break this off into its own class file, control dot, move type to a model.cs. There we go. So now I have 2 models, and the one we're going to use is this forecast model, which will then contain this other model. All right, so in here, what we're going to do is we're going to create just a really simple little page that's going to get this, it's going to call this API when the page loads, and it's going to load all the information about the forecast. So let's start off by giving it this page a name. So at page. And if you're not familiar with how Blazor server works, I've got an intro to Blazor server that would be really helpful, a video on that will walk you through all these things in more depth. I'm just basically touching on the high points here, because again, it's outside of the scope of this video, but I do have a video covering all this content, as well as, of course, the course Blazor Server in Depth, which would go into a lot more detail on this stuff. Okay, so page would be, let's call this the, just call it weather. All right, that's the URL for the page. So the localhost and the port number /weather will give us this page. Before we go any further, let's go ahead and add this to our navigation. So I'm going to copy this and I say weather here. Probably need an H in there. And there's the link to it. Let's change the icon because it's right now a list. And there's a whole bunch of different ones you could choose. I don't think there's an actual weather icon. So what you can do, I like doing this, just run it for a little bit and then hold, and stop. Well, now we've got, actually there's one called random. So let's do the random one. All right. It's not the right icon, but it's great for demos. So now we have a link to our page. We can actually go to it when we launch this directly. Okay, so you can launch, you can see the navigation on the left. We click on it, it goes right to that page. Now, this is where the HTTP client stuff starts. We want to inject. Now, this is how you do dependency injection in a Blazor server or even Blazor client project. Is you do an @inject on the page. In this case, I'm going to inject an HTTP client factory. Let's call it client factory. And then what we're going to do is down here in the code section, I'm going to say protected override. I'm going to override the on-initialized async. And it has had problems with the formatting for a while. They're working on it. It's tricky to get formatting right in a Blazor server page, but just note that that is something that is on the list of things to get fixed. So on-initialized async. This will run after this is injected, after the client factory is injected, before the page is rendered. So that's the important thing, is you want this, if possible, to run right away. So as soon as the page is initialized, after this is filled up. Because if you ran it in the constructor, then this would be null, this client factory. So that's too early to run it. And if you wait till the page is rendered, then that's kind of too late. So you want to run it on initialized async. Now, if you have server rendering turned on for some Blazor clients, then you might have the potential to run this twice. There are ways you can check for that, but it's not usually an issue. Okay, we also don't need to return based on initialized async. We can ignore that. So in here, what we're going to do is we're going to use our HTTP client in some way. So first, I'm going to say var request and create a request equals new HTTP request message. This is one way of doing it. I'm going to show you a quicker way, but I want to show you the full way first because there are times when the quicker way won't work and you need to use the full way. So create a request message first. And this is going to be a HTTP method dot, we'll do a get. Notice we have all the different verbs here, get, post, put, delete, head. There's patch down here as well. So we want a get command. So it's going to get information. And then I'm going to pass in, let's do it in the next line, just give us a little more space. I'm going to pass in, I think I still have it in the clipboard. I do not. Now I do. There we go. So there is our URL to call. So that's the URL that I called. Let me pull it up here. Right here. So I pass in this URL and I get this information back. If I change this number, I would get a different location back. All right, so now we have our request set up. And what I'm going to do is now create a client. So I say var client, this is our HTTP client, equals client factory dot create client. And what this does is it uses the factory to create a client for us. And so it'll either pull from an existing client out, or it will create a new client depending on some internal rules. There is a pool of clients that the client factory has that it will pull from. The reason this is important, instead of just creating a new HTTP client every time, is because you can actually have socket exhaustion from having too many open clients if you don't close them properly. Plus, it caused some overhead in your machine, and it was just a little messier to just call HTTP client directly. Well, now using the client factory, we can create these clients using the factory, which properly creates them and properly makes sure they're closed and all the rest. So we don't have to worry about how it is disposed of. It disposes of itself just fine, and it refreshes them on a certain cycle so that the DNS does not get stale, but it also doesn't have too many open at a time. It takes care of a lot of stuff behind the scenes. This is kind of like what async await does for threading, where there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. There's a lot of rules behind the scenes how it works, but on our side, we just say, await. So in this case, on our side, we just say create client, and it will create the client or give us an existing client. We don't have to care about which. So now we can say HTTP response message, response equals await client dot send async, and here's the request to send. So it's going to send the request out and get a response back. And it's yelling at me because I have an await but no async up here. I often forget that you have to mark an override as async, even if it always would be async. All right, so now we have our response message, but we're not really done yet. We'd say if response.is success status code. That's going to look to make sure that it's a success, which means a 200 or a 201. There's a few other possibilities for the return type. But if it is, then we can do something to get that data. So let's come up to the top here above protected override, and we're going to say weather forecast. Let's go weather forecast model. And it says HTTP client demo.models.weather forecast model. Notice how it's show up in IntelliSense, even though we don't have a using for this. That's kind of nice. Now, I could add the using up here, or what I can do is go over to imports and say at using HTTP client demo.models. And that will then ensure that models are available without a using statement on any of my pages. I'm going to do that instead. Let's call this forecast. Like so. I'm not going to initialize it. I'm also going to add a string, error string. We're going to use that in just a minute if we don't have a success status code. So now I have my forecast. Now what I can do is I can put the value in here. So forecast equals await response dot content dot read from JSON async. And it's going to be the weather forecast model, like so. But I am missing a using statement here as well. So let's go back to imports. And I believe it's at using system.net.http.json. That's the one we brought in from our NuGet package. So system.net.http.json. That's the extension methods. And sure enough, that's the one we want. So what it's going to do is it's going to take our content and it's going to read from JSON async, which means it's going to take this model and it's going to read the JSON and put it into this strongly typed model. we'll get back forecast, which is a weather forecast model. This just shortens our path to getting our data back into a strongly typed model. That's what that extension method does. Notice the icon here. It's a little small, but this icon indicates an extension method. So let's do an else here. And just for sake of completeness, we're going to say error string equals there was an error getting our forecast. Okay, something like that. We could, if you wanted to, grab the response.status code. Let's just make it string interpolation. We'll do a colon and then say, let's grab something from the response. Response.reason phrase. Okay, so it's going to give us the reason phrase for what the error was if there was one. So this is how we create a client and then how we can use it to make a call. Notice this is a GET call. We could do a POST or anything else. Since it's a GET call, we're getting data back, therefore we can do read from JSON async. But even if we weren't getting data back, we could still do this is success status code. Now let's do one little cleanup thing here. I'm going to say error string equals null here, just in case we have the error string already populated from a previous attempt, and maybe we do a second attempt, something like that. So I'm going to annul this out if the forecast comes through properly. So now up here, what I'm going to do in my HTTP section is I'm going to say if string.isNull or white space on error string equals false. So there's something in the error string. Then I'm going to say div class equals h2 to get me that size that I want, and just say error string. With the this is the Razor syntax that allow me to put C# code here. So if it's an error string, show that. Else if forecast is null. So there's no error string, but the forecast is null. That means we're still waiting for that forecast to come back. Therefore, div class equals h4, something a little smaller here. Just say loading. Now this is where I typically put some kind of a GIF or something like that that would indicate load. From here, we'll have one more else, and this would indicate that there is no error and there is data in the forecast. So that's what this else indicates. So we're going to create a little table to show some data. Table class equals table and table striped like so. And then we'll create a t-head with a class equals t-head dark. I like the dark header. It makes it look a little nicer. And a row inside here and th inside here for date. And then another th for weather state. That's the, is it cloudy, partly cloudy, windy, those kind of things. th, not ht. And this is going to be the low, as in the low temperature for the day. And th for the high, as in the high temperature. I'm not indicating Celsius versus Fahrenheit because it's all Celsius. But again, you could translate those and have your two different numbers if you wanted to. T-body, again, this is just to show off that it's working. That's all I want to do here. So at for each, not forecast, at for each, let's get that snippet in play. For each, let's say w in forecast dot consolidated weather. So this is the list of weather items in there. So let's go back to our weather forecast model. We have consolidated weather. That's the property that has that list of day forecast model. So we're going to grab that and say for each one of those, let's create a row where we'll have a few TDs. Let's grab this, I'm going to copy it, and let's do 4 of them. There we go. At w dot, and this is applicable date. The IntelliSense here at w dot, notice it gives you IntelliSense for pretty much everything, which is a little frustrating. But once you start typing, it figures out, oh, this is the object you're talking about actually. So weather state name, there we go. So at w, and now it actually figured it out after a couple attempts here. This is the min temperature. Of course, it messed up the placement of that. There we go. Like I said, this is a little difficult for the team to figure out how to make all these different pieces work together and make IntelliSense intelligent when you're mixing so many different languages and systems together. So they do a pretty good job. They're still struggling on Blazor a little bit. So there's our table. We haven't put anything about the overall data, which is things like location, which is the title, the time zone, the sunrise and sunset. I will skip that for now because this is just a demo to show that it works. It's not a full demo to show how to create a weather page. Okay, so this should give us all we need to see if this call works. Let's run this and see what happens. So I'm going to run it. I'm running an IS Express, which means it will give me a different port number than you might have. That's okay. My port number is 44344, kind of a nice port number. Let's go to weather. Notice there's that random icon. It says loading, and then it pops in. And according to this, in Philadelphia on 5/27 of 2020, they had showers, and the low was 18.8, and the high was 23. Tomorrow, it's going to be light rain, then showers, more showers, heavy rain, and then light clouds starting on the 1st of June. So there's our weather forecast. Note that it first said loading, and then it popped onto this page. So that if statement is working. Let's now just make a little tweak to this and break the URL. So I come down here, and my URL right now, this is the valid URL. But what if I change this number and add 2 zeros at the end? That's probably not valid. Let's try it again and see if we can't get a different value here for our weather. It says loading, and then it says there was an error getting our forecast not found. That's the message. If you looked at the error code, it would say 404. So we haven't found our forecast for this location, which is understandable. But now it shows that our error message does work and that it doesn't throw an exception here when it can't get a valid response. So this isn't going to throw an exception if you have a 404. It's going to put that into your response message. You need to check for that, and then if it's not successful, do something with that error. So like I said, that was the long way of doing this. Let's comment all this out so you can have it. I'm going to put the source code in a link. You have to give your email address. That's kind of our exchange here. If you want to pay with your email address, you get the source code for this video. You can have this and play around that directly. Or of course, you could just type it from the screen. That's fine. But what I'm going to do here is I've commented all this code out, and now I'm going to say var client again equals client factory.createClient. Okay, so same exact code as before, but now what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a try catch, and we'll have exception EX like so. I'm not going to rethrow it. And in here, I'm going to say forecast equals await client dot get from JSON async weather forecast model. And I'm going to pass in that full URL, which let's copy that full URL from up here. Oops, let's take off the double zeros that make it invalid. There we go. So there's that full URL, which we can unpin this so you can see the full thing. So that's one line. This one line replaces the create the request and get this async back and do this. But notice that since it does all of this, including this line right here, what happens if you don't have a valid response back saying here's some data? What if you have a 404? Well, that's where the try catch comes in. We wrap this, it's going to throw an exception if we don't have valid data coming back. So what we can do here is say error string equals, and let's actually just grab this right here. I'm going to copy all of this and paste it down here. But instead of reason phrase, I'm going to say ex.message. And again, I will in here say error string equals null. So that these lines right here are the equivalent of all of these lines up here. All right, so it is a lot of, well, some saved work here. And it saves you having to remember how to do the is success status code and all the rest. You do the more common C# method, which is the try catch. We're kind of used to that. So this could be an alternative for you. Let's run this and make sure it works the exact same way, even though I changed pretty much all the code. So weather forecast loading, and there's your forecast. So that did work. Now what we're going to do is we're going to make this a little better. You see, right now, I'm passing the full URL in. Well, that's even a simple version of calling an API, because sometimes you have to add things like headers, where you say, here is the authentication token, or here is my client profile, or my client ID, those kind of things in the headers. Well, this isn't dealing with any of that. So let's make our lives a little easier. Let's go over, notice I said create client. We're actually going to create named clients. So let's go over to our startup.cs. And in here we have add HTTP Client. Well, I'm going to add a new one. I'm going to say services.add HTTP Client. But this time I'm going to say it's going to be called Meta. Okay, because that's the service name is Meta something. Meta Weather. Okay, I'm just going to call it Meta. And then I'm going to pass in the configuration. So say C for configuration, our arrow, and then inside of here, we're going to say c.base address equals new URI. And that URI is going to start with HTTPS as www.metaweather.com/API/. So that's the base address. We could also do things like C and then have our default request headers or add a request header, those type of things. Response headers. There's a bunch of stuff we can put in here if we want to configure our API. But that's all I need to do. What this does, it creates a configuration that we can ask for by name. And now this also has our base address, which means that to call this, I just need to put whatever's on the end after /API. So with that, let's come back over here to our weather data. And instead of doing this way, I'm going to say meta, like so. And that requests a client that's of the type meta, or it's named meta. Now I can take off all of this. I don't have to remember the whole URL, just the ending of that URL. What this also makes really convenient is if your API ever changes locations, you can change it in one spot. Now, normally what you do is in startup, you'd probably be pulling this from configuration, not hard coding it into your C# code. So instead of doing this, you'd probably cut this out and you'd say configuration dot get value of type string, and then let's give a name to it. Let's call this our API, our meta API, something like that. And then over in our appsettings.json, we can say meta API is, whoops, wow. Let's try it again. There we go. Meta API like so. So now it can even pull from our configuration, but it only pulls once. It's not like it's pulling every time we do a call because we just set it up once. Okay, so now this is a named HTTP client. Notice I still have this HTTP client as well. You can have multiple so that you can have multiple named ones and a default one. That way you don't have to always use a named one. Maybe you have a one-off call you want to make. Well, you can do it by saying just HTTP client, no name, and then giving a full path. But this way, it's configured for us. Let's run this again just to verify that, in fact, it does work as intended. Let's run this, go to weather. There's an error, no such known host. Okay, so it doesn't work. Excellent. Let's find out why. My guess is it has something to do with loading from our configuration. So just to kind of verify, I'm going to say string URI equals this right here. And then I'll put a breakpoint in here. Let's just first make sure it's pulling from the configuration right. This is debugging step 101, okay? Is first make sure you have some values coming through. So URI is, it's got 4 W's in metaweather.com. That ain't right. So let's go ahead and stop this. And now go to appsettings.json and fix that. Let's go back to startup, make sure that breakpoint's off. It is. Let's run this again and see if it works. Okay, so debugging one step at a time. It may not be the only problem we have. It was cool, but do it one step at a time. Figure out and verify each step. Don't assume that the step is correct. Okay, because I was reading properly from the config file, so I could have said, "Oh, I know it's reading the config file right, so therefore it can't be that." Well, yes, it can. Because I typed something wrong. So don't assume steps. Just take it one step at a time and debug those issues. Okay, so this now works. It's pulling from our named configuration, and we've now shortened how much we have to actually put in here to just the extension of our API, something after the API /. So that's really all there is to using HTTP Client. Using the factory sets it up properly, and using the extension method NuGet package allows you to make really easy calls, just that one-liner call that you do have to wrap in a try-catch for exception purposes, but otherwise you don't have to remember all this setup stuff like the HTTP request message and then the response and the success status code and so on. So this just makes life a little easier. Now, there's not every extension known for this extension method class. So not everything will work. There's not, I believe all the verbs aren't covered. There's a couple that aren't. So in that case, you revert back to the standard way of making the call up here. Okay, so either will work, but this allows you to use the client factory. You can use a named instance or not. And using this will allow you to safely talk to web applications. Okay, I think that's all for now. I do want to know if you have any questions about this. Is there anything that kind of doesn't make sense or stumped you? We will be covering in a future video talking about cores. So the cross origin and how you can deal with that, whether you control the API or not. That's a future video coming out. But until then, if you have any other questions, let me know down in the comments below. That's the best way of asking for a new topic or an addition to an existing topic. Okay? Thanks for watching, and as always, I am Tim Corey.